Some memories stick with you not because they make sense, but because they defy every logical explanation you've ever tried to construct. I used to pride myself on being level-headed. I wasn't the kind of person to jump to paranormal conclusions at the slightest creak in the floorboards. But whatever unfolded on that particular night permanently shattered my view of reality. Back then, I was seeing a guy named Evan. His family owned an immense plot of land tucked miles away from civilization, far beyond city limits. Surrounded by sprawling fields and dense clusters of trees, their house sat in total isolation, with no neighbors in sight and no passing traffic once you pulled past the main gate. When Evan's parents left town for a few days, he asked me to stay over for Saturday night. Jokingly, I mentioned I wasn't sure I could handle the sheer emptiness of such a remote place. He just laughed it off, assuring me there was zero to worry about. For the first several hours, he was completely right. We spent the evening cooking together, sharing a bottle of wine and losing track of time over card games. Before dozing off on the living room couch past midnight, I can't say how long we had been asleep before something violently jarred me awake. At first, I assumed I was caught in the middle of a bizarre nightmare. Then the entire structure of the house began to tremor. A deep, low-frequency roar reverberated right through the walls. It wasn't an explosion, nor was it distant thunder. It carried the chilling resonance of a gigantic foghorn, magnified to a deafening, chest-compressing scale. Window panes vibrated. Kitchenware rattled violently inside the cupboards. I could physically feel the shock wave pulsing through the couch. Evan was already on his feet the second our eyes snapped open. "What was that?" I managed to whisper. He didn't reply, simply staring out toward the massive window overlooking the backfield. Total emptiness. No headlights, no stray animals, no movement at all. Just a blanket of pitch-black wilderness. I stood beside him, desperately bargaining with myself, trying to invent any plausible excuse. Maybe some heavy agricultural equipment broke down nearby. Maybe it was just a freak acoustic echo. Then the backyard erupted into light. A blinding white flash detonated somewhere deep within the tree line, illuminating the entire living room in a harsh, ghostly glare for a split second. We both recoiled in shock. Without a word, Evan rushed to kill the television and flick off the remaining lights, muttering that we needed total darkness inside to see into the yard. I hated the idea, but I stayed glued to his side as we crept toward the kitchen. Minutes ticked by in suffocating silence as we stared into the blackness. Suddenly, the motion sensor floodlight mounted over the back patio flickered to life. Evan stiffened instantly. "That shouldn't be triggering," he murmured, edging closer to the glass. When I asked why, his voice dropped to a nervous whisper. "It's motion activated, and it doesn't pick up small wildlife." Before I could process his warning, a new sound cut through the air. It wasn't footsteps, and it wasn't speech. It was a cluster of overlapping voices whispering simultaneously, warped and distorted as if someone were speaking from deep underwater miles away. I locked eyes with Evan. "Someone is out there." He didn't argue. Moments later, two tall silhouettes drifted past the side window. They didn't walk with a normal human cadence. Their movements were stiff, unnatural, almost sliding sideways through the dark. Evan snatched his phone to dial emergency services, but his face fell as he stared at the display. No service. My hands shook as I checked mine, completely dead. In a place where we'd always had full bars, it defied all reason. Panic spiked when the handle of the side door rattled. Once, twice, aggressively. Someone was trying to force it open, a door I had personally watched Evan lock before we went to bed. Terrified, I screamed out that we knew they were outside. The rattling halted instantly. Heavy, suffocating silence hung in the air for a few seconds before the wet, distorted whispering resumed, sounding much closer this time. Evan bluffed loudly, shouting that the police were already en route, even though our phones remained lifeless blocks of glass. Right then, the deafening foghorn sound tore through the night once more. The house shook with such violence that I dropped to my knees, slapping my hands over my ears. The low, droning roar lasted an eternity before snapping shut into dead silence. And just like that, the nightmare shifted gears. The shadows were gone. Another brilliant flash lit up the yard, and the exact second it faded, our phones came back to life, buzzing frantically with a flood of delayed notifications. Then both the front door and the side door swung wide open on their own. I let out a piercing shriek as Evan bolted across the room to slam and lock both entrances. When we finally got a signal through to the authorities, officers arrived to sweep the property. They checked every entry point and combed the yard with flashlights, looking thoroughly bewildered by our frantic explanation. One officer kept pressing us on which way the intruders could have fled. We couldn't give him an answer. But the most disturbing detail came when they checked the ground. It had rained earlier that evening, leaving a thick layer of soft mud all around the perimeter of the house. If two people had been pacing outside our windows and trying our doors, they should have left deep, unmistakable footprints. There were none. Not a single track marred the mud. No forced locks, no physical traces whatsoever. Dismissing it as an unfounded scare, the officers eventually left. Evan and I spent the remainder of the night sitting side by side in the dark living room until dawn broke. Months later, when I brought it up, Evan claimed nothing like that had ever happened to him or his family before or since. I've spent years trying to rationalize every piece of it. Maybe it was trespassers, maybe an electrical fault, maybe a strange atmospheric anomaly. But when you piece it all together, none of the math works out. I don't know what was lurking outside that house. I don't know what generated that terrifying sound. And I don't know why reality itself seemed to pause for those agonizing minutes. I've never felt fully comfortable sharing this. Not because I care if people believe me, but because I was there, and a part of me still struggles to accept it. Some of the most unsettling experiences happen when you are at your lowest and most isolated. A few years back, I went through a nasty breakup that completely upended my life. Unable to stay in the home we had shared, I needed a fresh start. My parents offered me the use of their empty lakeside cabin for a while. It was early spring, meaning the surrounding properties were entirely vacant, the trees were bare, and the nights were freezing cold. I packed up my belongings, brought along my dog Milo, and settled in. To my surprise, I actually enjoyed the solitude. I worked remotely during the day and spent my evenings watching television, enjoying the quiet stillness of the lake. For the first couple of weeks, everything was peaceful. But then Milo started acting strange. One evening, I opened the back door to let him out into the yard. Usually he would bolt straight through, but that night, he froze several feet from the threshold. He stared intently into the pitch-black darkness, letting out a low, uneasy whine. Assuming he had spotted a raccoon or a stray animal, I stepped out onto the porch and called his name. That was when I noticed the sky. High above the far side of the lake, several bright points of light were floating. At first, I mistook them for distant stars, until one of them suddenly glided sideways across the horizon, stopped dead, and snapped in a completely different direction. Within seconds, multiple glowing spheres were darting above the water. They did not move like drones or airplanes. They accelerated upward, drifted laterally, and stopped instantaneously without any deceleration. After several agonizing minutes of watching them perform these impossible maneuvers, every single light shot straight up into the atmosphere and vanished. The second they disappeared, Milo trotted outside as if nothing had ever been wrong. The next morning, I called my father, who had spent decades living around that lake. When I described what I saw, he admitted he had never witnessed anything like it in his entire life. I tried to convince myself there was a logical explanation, but that evening, my doubts vanished. At almost the exact same hour, Milo began whining anxiously at the back door once more. Dread washed over me as I looked through the glass. The lights were back, but this time, they were much closer, hovering just above the surface of the water. As I watched in utter disbelief, several of the glowing spheres slowly drifted toward one another, merging into a single massive orb of light. It hovered ominously over the dark water for a few brief moments before dropping down below the distant tree line and vanishing out of sight. I barely slept a wink that night. The next day, I spent hours scouring the internet for reports of military drones, atmospheric phenomena, or satellite tests, but nothing matched the impossible movements I had witnessed. Part of me wanted to pack my bags and drive back to the city, but curiosity won out. I needed to know if they would return a third time. Sure enough, right on schedule, the sky filled with light once again. But their behavior was completely different now. They were no longer moving at random. They were advancing in a structured, deliberate formation, inching closer and closer to the cabin. Standing behind the glass door, a faint, low electrical hum began to vibrate through the air, sounding like a buzzing fluorescent bulb. Horror set in as two of the lights broke formation and charged directly toward the house. I grabbed Milo, dropped to the hardwood floor, and covered my head, bracing for a devastating collision. Instead of an impact, complete silence fell over the property. I slowly peeked upward to find the yard entirely empty and still. There were no scorch marks, no broken branches, and no physical evidence that anything had ever been there. In the years since, my friends have tried to brush it off as distant aircraft or a sleep-deprived hallucination. But I know what I saw, and more importantly, I know Milo reacted to those entities long before they ever became visible in the night sky. I kept this story to myself for years because I knew how ridiculous it would sound. Even now, I sometimes question my own memory, but I know what I saw. It happened during a family road trip almost a decade ago. My wife Laura, our two kids, and I were traveling the country in an old motorhome. We did not have a strict itinerary. We would just drive until we found an interesting spot, stay a few nights, and move on. One campground ended up becoming an unexpected long stay. Our son made friends with another boy there, and they begged us to stick around. The campground was massive. There was a main hub with picnic tables, but the individual sites were spread far apart in a dense wilderness, surrounded by mountains, fields, and a river. It was beautiful, but after sunset, it was pitch black. At the time, I was secretly smoking. I had told my family I quit, but I had not. Every night around 11 p.m., after everyone fell asleep, I would quietly slip out of the motorhome and walk into the woods to light up. I found a secluded overlook about 15 minutes from our site. It became my private spot. One night, as I sat there alone around 11:30 p.m., I heard a deep, rhythmic, pulsing sound. It sounded like someone humming and changing pitch over and over. It was not an animal, not machinery, and definitely not something natural to those woods. Curiosity got the better of me. Instead of heading back, I walked deeper into the trees toward the noise. The closer I got, the louder it vibrated through the air. Then, without warning, it abruptly cut off. I froze. That was when I realized the entire forest had gone dead silent. No insects, no wind, no leaves rustling. It felt like someone had turned the volume down on the entire world. Then a subtle rustle came from behind me. I turned around. Standing about 10 feet away between two trees was a massive, impossibly thin figure. It was far taller than any human. Dark shadows hid most of its face, but I could tell it was staring right at me. Neither of us moved. My instinct screamed at me to run, but I was paralyzed. I shifted my weight forward slightly, and the entity instantly jerked backward in response. It was not a shadow. It was reacting to my movements. I took another tiny step. It moved again. Now I could make out its unnaturally long arms, narrow torso, oversized head, and two faint points of light reflecting where its eyes should be. I suddenly felt terrifyingly vulnerable. We stayed locked in that silent confrontation for what felt like forever. Then the figure crouched low as if preparing to lunge. I tensed up to run, but instead of charging, it released a short, sharp, mechanical noise. In a fraction of a second, it jerked sideways and disappeared into the dense trees with terrifying speed. I stumbled backward, barely able to breathe. When I cautiously approached the spot where it had stood, there were no tracks, no broken branches, and no sign of life. Slowly, the ambient sounds of the forest returned to normal, but I was thoroughly rattled. When I finally got back to the motorhome around 3 a.m., my wife was waiting outside, furious. She told me I had been gone for hours. I laughed, thinking she was exaggerating, until she pointed at the clock showing 3:15 a.m. Multiple hours had vanished. and I had zero memory of where that time went. I told her everything. She could see the sheer terror in my face and knew I was not joking. I stayed awake all night, staring out the window toward the tree line. Right around 5 a.m., a powerful rushing sound tore through the air directly above our motorhome, like a massive object sweeping past at high speed. When I ran outside, the sky was completely clear. We packed up and left first thing that morning. Over the years, I have heard other people share similar stories about tall figures, missing time, and strange forest dead zones. I do not know if it was an unknown creature, something unearthly, or a phenomenon beyond our understanding. All I know for sure is that something was watching me in those woods, and those reflecting eyes still haunt me to this day. When I accepted a summer job at a traveling carnival nearly 10 years ago, I expected the usual routine. Long hours, greasy food, screaming children, and rides that looked considerably less safe during daylight than they did after dark. What I did not expect was to find an attraction that officially did not even exist. The carnival had been set up in an empty lot on the edge of town. It was relatively small, consisting of a Ferris wheel, bumper cars, game booths, a food court, and an old-fashioned attraction called the Mirror Pavilion. I worked security around the perimeter of that specific ride. My job was mostly boring. I stood outside, checked that nobody was causing trouble, helped frightened kids, find their parents, and made sure guests did not climb over the safety barriers. The first strange incident happened on my third night. Right around 10 p.m., a woman came running out of the attraction exit. She looked deeply confused rather than frightened. I stepped toward her and asked if she was okay. She stared at me for several seconds before asking where the exit was. I pointed right behind her and told her it was right there, but she frowned and insisted that was not where she came out. I assumed she was just disoriented, but a few minutes later, another guest came out asking the exact same question, followed by another. I mentioned it to one of the ride operators, but he just laughed and said people get turned around in mirror mazes all the time. That explanation satisfied me until I started noticing something much more concerning. The attraction had a counter beside the entrance. Every guest received a stamped paper ticket before going inside, and the operator collected them when people exited. One night around 11 p.m., I personally counted 12 people entering the attraction, but only 11 tickets came back. When I brought it up to the operator, he shrugged it off and said people drop their tickets inside all the time. The next evening, it happened again. 14 people entered, but only 13 returned. Later that night, around 11:30 p.m., 9 went in and only 8 came out. After nearly a week of this, I became convinced there was something deeply wrong with the ride. I decided to investigate the interior myself after closing, right around 1 a.m. The ride was completely different without the music and flashing lights. In the middle of the night, everything was dead silent. I walked through the attraction with my flashlight, the mirrors making the narrow corridors seem endless. When I reached the final room, I noticed something I had never seen during the day. There was a narrow wooden door hidden behind a heavy curtain. It had no handle, but when I pressed a small metal plate beside the frame, the door clicked and swung inward. Behind it was a narrow service passage. I stared into the darkness, realizing that based on the carnival layout, this corridor should not have existed. The attraction sat in the middle of an open lot, so there was nowhere for a hallway like this to lead. Still, my curiosity won. I stepped inside and followed the passage until it opened into a small windowless room. Inside, dozens of personal items were neatly arranged along metal shelves. Shoes, phones, backpacks, jackets, and wallets. I immediately recognized several items from guests I had seen entering the ride during the previous week. Then my stomach dropped when I looked at the back wall. Pinned across the wood were dozens of photographs, each showing someone standing outside the Mirror Pavilion. Every single person in the photos was looking directly toward the camera. At the bottom of the wall, someone had written a single phrase in black ink, "They always come back out." I slowly backed away, horrified. Suddenly, a floorboard creaked somewhere deeper in the passage. I spun around, but saw nothing in the beam of my flashlight. Then I heard heavy, deliberate footsteps coming from the darkness, moving slowly toward me. Panic took over. I sprinted back through the passage, slammed the hidden door shut, and ran out of the building. The next morning at 8 a.m., I confronted the carnival manager. The moment I mentioned the hidden room behind the curtain, his entire demeanor changed. He asked if I opened that door, and when I told him I did, he went pale and said I should not have. I demanded to know what was back there. He stayed silent for a long moment before admitting that the attraction had been purchased from another carnival decades earlier, and nobody knew how old it really was. He said workers occasionally found personal belongings inside the walls, but nobody ever figured out where they came from. Then he looked at me and said words I will never forget. "We don't ask questions about that place." I quit my job that afternoon. Before leaving the lot for the last time around 2 p.m., I looked toward the mirror pavilion one final time. A family was walking up to the entrance, a father, a mother, and 2 young children. I watched them step inside under the bright entrance lights. But as they walked through the doorway, I noticed 6 distinct, elongated shadows stretching across the ground behind them, even though only 4 people had entered. I never returned to another carnival after that day, and years later, one horrifying question still haunts me. Who was standing right behind them? When I was 12 years old, I found something in my grandmother's attic that would haunt me for the rest of my life. I was helping her clean out old storage boxes when I pulled out a faded, brittle ticket with a strange red symbol printed in the corner. Across the front, it read Willow Creek Autumn Fair. I had never heard of Willow Creek, but when I showed it to my grandmother, her entire expression changed. She snatched it from my hand, tore it in half, and ordered me to forget about it. Later that night, however, I found the 2 ripped pieces lying on the kitchen counter. She handed them back to me with a deadpan warning, "Just do not take it anywhere." Naturally, I kept it. 3 days later, a traveling carnival set up camp in an empty lot on the edge of town. It looked entirely normal with bright lights, loud music, food stands, and prize booths. As a joke, I brought the ticket with me to see if the workers would recognize it. At the front gate, I handed it to an elderly man collecting admission tickets. The moment he saw the red symbol, his smile vanished. He asked where I got it, handed it right back, and told me in a low voice never to use it. I laughed it off and went inside, quickly forgetting about the incident. But a couple of hours later, while standing near one of the game booths, I noticed a framed black and white photograph hanging behind the counter. It showed the exact same carnival setup, but the picture was decades old. In the center of the crowd stood a young boy about my age, and beneath the photo was a handwritten caption, "Caleb Vance, missing October 14th. My stomach dropped. October 14th was the exact date printed on my ticket. I immediately looked for the old ticket collector, but he was gone. Instead, I showed the ticket to a woman running a dart game. Her face went pale the moment she saw it. She told me to put it away and whispered that every few years, someone finds one of those tickets, and shortly after, someone disappears. I thought she was just trying to scare me until later that evening. I was walking past the old fun house around 9 p.m. when I heard a faint voice calling my name from inside the pitch-black attraction. There was no one around me. When the voice whispered my name a second time, panic seized me, and I sprinted all the way home. That night, I locked the ticket inside a glass jar and hid it deep in my closet. But when I woke up the next morning, the ticket was sitting on my bedroom windowsill. And right beneath the Carnival logo, a second line of text had appeared, Julian Reed. Terrified, I ran to my grandmother. When she saw my name on the paper, she sat down and finally told me the truth. Decades ago, when the carnival first visited, several children vanished without a trace. Only one boy ever came back, Caleb Vance. He was found wandering a deserted country road 2 days after disappearing. He remembered almost nothing, except being trapped in a dark room beneath the carnival floor, hearing a voice repeatedly whisper, "Wait for the next one." My grandmother insisted we burn it immediately. We drove out to a dirt road outside town, built a small fire, and dropped the ticket into the flames. I watched the symbol curl into black ash and thought the nightmare was finally over. But as we turned back to the car, A faint, broken carousel melody began playing in the distance, slowly creeping closer from an empty road where no carnival existed. I never saw that traveling fair again. But every year on the night of October 14th, I hear that same broken music echoing outside my window. And right before midnight, faint colored lights begin to sweep silently across my bedroom ceiling. I have never liked traveling carnivals. My younger sister Chloe absolutely loved them, and she could easily spend an entire evening riding attractions while I stood around, waiting for the moment we could go home. One Saturday night, she finally convinced me to go with her to a small fair setup on the outskirts of town. It was nearly empty because it had been raining earlier in the evening, and most families had already left for the night. After about 1 hour, Chloe called our mother for a ride home. I decided to stay behind for a little while longer, figuring I would just walk around until the park officially closed. That was when I noticed an old funhouse tucked away in a quiet corner of the lot. I had never been inside one alone before, and there was no line, no music coming from the entrance, and just a single, flickering sign above the doorway that read, "Step inside." I should have kept walking, but out of pure boredom, I bought a ticket. The attendant barely looked at me as he handed it over and told me to enjoy myself. I stepped through the heavy door and it slammed shut behind me. Immediately, the outside noise of the carnival faded into a muffled hum. All I could hear was the hollow sound of my own footsteps echoing against the plywood floor. I walked through the first dark corridor, initially laughing at the distorted mirrors. One made me look impossibly tall, while another stretched my face sideways. Then in the reflection of a long mirror at the end of the hallway, I saw someone standing directly behind me. It was a tall, unnaturally thin man, standing completely motionless in the shadows. I quickly turned around, but the hallway behind me was completely empty. I turned back toward the mirror and my heart stopped. He was still standing there in the reflection, except now he was standing much closer to my back. I spun around again, but there was nobody there. Panic set in, and my heart began pounding against my chest. I rushed forward into a room filled with circular mirrors, frantically searching for an exit. But every doorway seemed to lead deeper into another maze. That was when I noticed something terrifying. The man was not appearing in every reflection. He was only visible in the mirrors directly in front of me, facing the direction I was walking. I froze in place, and in the reflection, so did he. I took one slow step backward, and in the mirror, he took one step forward, closing the distance between us. That was enough to break my composure. I sprinted blindly through the maze, crashing through a rubber doorway into another corridor. Behind me, I heard rapid, heavy footsteps giving chase. I did not dare look back. I sprinted until I saw the exit and burst out into the night air. The bright carnival lights hit me like daylight, and I stood there gasping for breath. The attendant looked at me in confusion and asked if I was okay. I pointed toward the entrance and told him someone was inside stalking me. He frowned, walked inside to check, and returned a few minutes later claiming the building was completely empty. When I reached into my pocket, I realized my wallet was missing, but the attendant shook his head and refused to let me back inside, coldly stating that the ride was now closed for the night. The police searched the attraction later that night, but they found no wallet, no hidden intruder, and no signs of anyone living inside. For several days, I tried to convince myself that I had just suffered a severe panic attack and imagined the whole thing. But then my girlfriend called me, sounding absolutely terrified. Someone using a burner number had been messaging her, claiming to be me. They knew my full name, where I worked, and even the private nickname I only used for her. The stranger eventually tried to lure her to an empty parking lot late at night, but luckily her father went with her instead. They found no broken down car or emergency, just a handwritten note taped to a light pole that read, "Look behind." We both changed our phone numbers immediately, and I stopped going anywhere alone after dark. Months later, I returned to the empty carnival grounds. The funhouse structure had been completely dismantled and removed. I asked a maintenance worker on the lot what happened, and he casually mentioned the attraction was taken away due to severe structural and safety issues. As I was walking back toward my car, I noticed a dirty leather object lying near the chain link fence. It was my missing wallet. Everything inside was completely untouched, except for one thing. Tucked into the clear ID slot was a printed photograph of my girlfriend, a picture I had never owned or kept in my wallet. On the back, written in thick black ink, were 4 words, "You left too soon." I threw the wallet in the trash and never went back. Years later, I still have one habit I cannot break. Whenever I walk past a mirror at night, I always glance behind my shoulder before looking at my reflection. Because deep down, I am terrified. I will see him standing right behind me,